The wind on the high plains did not just blow, it scoured. It was a living, malevolent thing that hunted for cracks in the siding and gaps in the window frames, carrying with it a relentless cargo of grit. Here, in the desolate stretch of the American West, late in the 1870s, the land was defined by what it lacked. There was no shade, no softness, and no mercy. The horizon was a flat, shimmering line where the pale blue sky met the tan earth, broken only by the jagged spine of distant ridges where the coyotes sang their starving songs at night. Dust lifted in constant thin veils from the wagon road that ran past Eleanor Marsh's boarding house. It coated the sagebrush until the green was choked out by gray, and it settled in the deep lines of the faces of the few men who passed through. Short, stubborn grass struggled between rocks that had baked in the sun since the beginning of time. On the edge of town, where the buildings thinned out and the true wilderness began, the wind whistled through the warped boards of abandoned shacks, sounding like a low, mournful flute played by a ghost. Ellie Marsh knew that sound better than she knew the sound of her own laughter. It was barely dawn, the light bleeding gray and cold over the eastern hills. When Ellie stepped out onto her back porch, the air was biting, sharp enough to freeze the breath in her lungs. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the fabric was worn thin and offered little protection against a morning that hovered near freezing. Her destination was the well, a stone circle 50 yards from the house, surrounded by mud that had frozen into jagged ruts during the night. She gripped the handle of the bucket, her fingers cracked and raw from years of lye soap and hard water. Every turn of the crank was a battle against gravity and rust. The chain groaned, a metal shriek that echoed in the silence, before the bucket splashed into the dark water below. When she hauled it up, the rope bit into her palms. The water was icy, sloshing over the rim to darken the hem of her dress. She did not complain. There was no one to hear her if she did. Inside the boarding house, the air was stale and cold. Ellie moved with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that survival was a series of chores to be completed before the sun went down. She knelt before the cast-iron stove, her knees aching on the hard floor, and fed it the scarce firewood she had chopped herself the evening before. The wood was dry and popped loudly as the flames took hold, offering the first promise of warmth the house had felt in hours. She measured out the coffee with a miser's hand. Coffee beans were expensive, and the freight wagons had been scarce lately. The resulting brew was weak, more brown water than true coffee, but it was hot. She set a pot of stew on the back burner to warm, mostly potatoes and onions, with a few scraps of salt pork for flavor. It was thin fare, but it was all she could offer the two men currently renting rooms upstairs. The kitchen was the heart of the house, yet it was also the place where the silence was loudest. A sturdy oak table sat in the center, large enough for 6, but only set for 3. Ellie looked at the empty chairs. They were not just furniture, they were monuments to a life that had shrunk. There was a time when she had imagined this table full of noise, the clamor of a family, the sound of a husband's boots on the floorboards, the cry of a child. Now, there was only the wind rattling the window pane. She moved to the sideboard to retrieve a spoon and paused. Her hand hovered over a small, bottom drawer. Without thinking, she pulled it open just an inch. Inside, nestled among folded linens she rarely used, was a tiny, carved wooden horse. It was no bigger than her thumb, rough-hewn but smoothed by the touch of her own fingers over the years. She stared at it for a long moment, the ache in her chest familiar and dull, like an old fracture that flared when the rain came. She pushed the drawer shut with a sharp click and turned back to the stove. By 7 in the morning, her boarders had come down. Mr. Abernathy was a man in his 60s with a hacking cough and a suspicion of everything that moved. Mr. Lewis was younger, a clerk at the bank who looked at Ellie with eyes that were too wet and hands that lingered too long when he passed her the salt. "Good morning, Mrs. Marsh, Mr." Lewis said, his voice oily. "The wind is fierce today. It is always fierce." Mr. Lewis, Ellie replied, not looking at him as she ladled the thin stew into his bowl. Mr. Abernathy grunted, tearing a piece of stale bread. Town says a storm is brewing. A bad one. Sky has that look. Ellie glanced out the window. The light was indeed strange, a pale, sickly yellow that seemed to bruise the clouds. I will see to the shutters after breakfast. The conversation died there. It usually did. Ellie ate her portion standing at the counter, her back to the men. She was not part of their world, nor they of hers. She was simply the woman who kept the roof over their heads and the fire in the stove. Later that morning, Ellie wrapped herself in her heavy coat and walked the half-mile into town for supplies. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together against the vastness of the plains, dusty and brown and tired. As she walked, she kept her head high, her eyes fixed on the horizon, but she felt the eyes on her. Two women stood outside the millinery shop, their bonnets bright against the drab wood. When they saw Ellie approaching, their conversation stopped abruptly. One of them, the wife of the local preacher, reached out and pulled her young daughter close to her skirts, steering the child slightly behind her as if Ellie were contagious. Ellie tightened her grip on her basket. She did not slow down. She did not look at them. "Did you see her dress?" she heard one of them whisper as she passed. The wind carried the words clearly. "The hem is frayed." "And no wonder," the other replied, her voice dropping to a hiss that was meant to be heard. "With no man to keep her, and that saloon money long gone, you reap what you sow." The shame burned Ellie's cheeks, hot and sharp, but her expression remained stony. The rumors were a shadow that she could not outrun. They said she had married her late husband, Frank, for his money, though Frank Marsh had died leaving her nothing but debt and a bad reputation. They whispered that Frank had died in a drunken fight, though the truth was darker and more complicated. And most damning of all, they remembered the 3 months after his death when Ellie, starving and desperate, had washed floors and poured drinks at the Silver Dollar Saloon to keep from losing the house. She had never gone upstairs. She had never sold anything but her labor. But in a town like this, the difference between a woman working in a saloon and a woman working for the saloon was a distinction no one cared to make. Men nodded to her as she passed the livery stable, tipping their hats, but their eyes were hard. Some looked through her. Others looked at her with a boldness that made her skin crawl. "Morning, Ellie," a man called out from the porch of the hotel. He was a ranch hand, leaning back in a chair with a toothpick in his mouth. "You look cold. Need someone to warm you up?" His companions laughed, a low, gritty sound. Ellie did not flinch. She kept walking, her boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel, her spine stiff as a rod. She had learned long ago that to react was to lose. Her errand done, she took the long way back, circling the edge of the town where the cemetery sat on a rise of ground that caught the full force of the gale. It was a lonely place, dotted with slate markers and wooden crosses that leaned away from the wind. Ellie stopped at a small grave near the back fence. There was no stone, only a simple wooden cross that she had nailed together herself. There was no name carved into the wood. The town had not allowed her to name the child she had lost. Not properly. Not with the rumors swirling about who the father might have been and why the baby had been born silent and blue. She knelt in the dirt, heedless of her dress. She placed a hand on the mound of earth, which was hard and cold. For a moment, the mask she wore for the town slipped. Her face crumpled, lines of grief etching themselves around her mouth and eyes. She touched the wood of the cross, tracing the grain. "I am here," she whispered to the wind. She stayed only a moment. It was dangerous to linger. Grief, like hope, was a luxury she could not afford. By late afternoon, Mr. Abernathy's prediction proved true. The sky had turned a terrifying, bruised yellow, the color of an old bruise. The wind, which had been a constant whistle, deepened into a roar. It tore at the shingles and slammed against the walls of the boarding house with the force of a physical blow. "Dust storm! Mister!" Abernathy shouted from the parlor, coughing as fine grit began to seep under the door. Ellie was already moving. She rushed from room to room, slamming the heavy wooden shutters closed and barring them. The light in the house died, replaced by a suffocating gloom. The air instantly grew thick, the smell of dust replacing the smell of stew. "Get to the back room," Ellie ordered her boarders. "It has the fewest windows. Keep the lamps low." The house groaned under the assault. The wind screamed, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like metal tearing. Sand and gravel peppered the siding like buckshot. Ellie stood in the kitchen, a wet rag pressed to her mouth to filter the air, listening to the fury outside. It felt as if the world were ending, as if the prairie intended to swallow the house and everyone in it. Then she heard it. It was a sound that did not belong to the storm. A dull, heavy thud against the front door. Ellie froze. She waited, thinking it was a loose branch or a piece of debris. Thud, thud. It was rhythmic, frantic. "Someone is out there," she whispered. She moved toward the hallway. "Mister." Lewis grabbed her arm, his face pale in the dim light. "You cannot open that door. Mrs. Marsh. The wind will rip the roof off. It is probably just a loose shutter." "It is a person," Ellie said, shaking him off. She reached the front door. The pounding came again, weaker this time, accompanied by a sound that might have been a shout or a moan. Ellie gripped the iron latch. She knew the risk. Opening the door could let the wind destroy everything she owned. It could break the windows, tear down the shelves, but the thought of a living soul caught in that maelstrom, suffocating in the grit, overrode her fear. She threw the latch and braced her shoulder against the wood. As soon as the catch released, the door exploded inward, hitting her with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The storm roared into the hallway, a blinding vortex of sand and wind. Ellie shielded her eyes, squinting into the yellow chaos. A shape lay collapsed across the threshold. It was a man. He was face down, his body half inside, half out. His hat was nearly torn apart, flapping uselessly against his back. He was not moving. "Help me!" Ellie screamed over the wind, grabbing the man's coat. "Mr. Lewis and Mr. Abernathy hung back, but Ellie did not wait for them. She dug her heels into the floorboards and heaved. The man was heavy, dead weight, but adrenaline gave her strength she did not know she possessed. She dragged him inch by inch until his boots cleared the door frame. With a final, desperate shove, she slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The roar was instantly muffled, though the house still shook. Ellie dropped to her knees beside the stranger. The dust swirled in the hallway, thick as smoke. She coughed, waving her hand to clear the air, and looked at what the storm had delivered. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from his boots and the spurs that clinked faintly as she turned him over. His poncho was heavy, woven with patterns she did not recognize, caked with layers of dust and dried blood. He groaned, a low, guttural sound. Ellie brushed the hair back from his forehead. His skin was burning hot, but his face was deathly pale beneath the dirt. A nasty gash ran along his brow, bleeding sluggishly, the blood mixing with the grit to form a dark paste. "Who is he, mister?" Lewis asked, peering over her shoulder with a wrinkled nose. "I do not know," Ellie said. She checked his pulse. It was thready and fast. "He looks like trouble." "Mister," Abernathy muttered. "Look at him. That is a pistol belt. Most men wear pistol belts." Ellie snapped. "Help me get him to the kitchen. It is warmest there." Together, they dragged the unconscious man into the kitchen and laid him on the rug near the stove. Ellie lit a second lamp and brought it close. Now she could see him clearly. He was a man in his mid-30s, with dark skin and high cheekbones that spoke of Mexican heritage. His hands, limp on the floor, were calloused and scarred. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering, his eyes opened, dark, unfocused, wide with delirium. He looked at Ellie but did not seem to see her. His lips moved, cracking the dust that coated them. "Jonah," he rasped. The word was barely a whisper. "Jonah?" Ellie repeated. "Is that your name?" He did not answer. His head lolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. "You should put him back outside, Mr. Abernathy said, his voice hard. "Or at least in the barn." A man like that? Coming out of nowhere? He is running from something. Ellie looked up at her boarder, her eyes flashing. "The storm does not care who we are," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "And I will not be like the storm. He stays." She dismissed the men, telling them to go back to their room. Reluctantly, they left, muttering to each other. Ellie was alone with the stranger. She fetched a basin of water and set it on the stove to boil. She found a bottle of whiskey she kept for toothaches and a clean rag, kneeling beside him. She began the work of tending to him. She unbuckled his gun belt first. The leather was worn, the holster tied down. The revolver was heavy, a tool of his trade. She set it on the table, far out of his reach. "I am going to take your coat off," she told him softly, though he could not hear her. She peeled away the heavy poncho and the dust-caked coat beneath it. His shirt was stuck to his skin in places where blood had dried. Ellie used her scissors to cut the fabric away, careful not to hurt him. When she pulled the shirt open, she drew in a sharp breath. His torso was a map of violence. There were old scars, white and jagged, crisscrossing his chest and ribs, bullet wounds that had healed poorly, knife slashes that had faded with time, and there were new injuries, deep bruising along his ribs that was turning purple and black, and the fresh gash on his head. He had been beaten, and recently, Ellie dipped the rag into the hot water, adding a splash of whiskey to it. The smell of alcohol rose in the warm kitchen air. She began to clean his face. She wiped away the mud and blood, her touch gentle. It was intimate work, touching a stranger this way. She traced the line of his jaw, the bridge of his nose. His skin was rough, weathered by sun and wind. As she worked, she felt a strange tension. It had been years since she had touched a man with anything other than polite distance. The warmth of his skin, the weight of his arm as she lifted it to clean a scrape on his elbow. It was jarring. She kept her movements clinical, respectful, but her heart beat a little faster against her ribs. He groaned again when the whiskey stung the cut on his brow. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a sudden, shocking strength. Ellie gasped, but did not pull away. "Shh," she soothed. "You are safe." His grip loosened, his hand falling back to the floor. She worked for an hour, cleaning and bandaging him as best she could. She covered him with a heavy quilt and sat in the chair beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the only sound was the popping of the fire and the stranger's ragged breathing. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the wind began to die down. Ellie had dozed off in the chair, her head resting on her arms on the table. A sharp intake of breath woke her. She lifted her head. The stranger, Jonah, was awake. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes darting around the room in a panic. His hand clawed at his hip, searching for the gun that was not there. Terror flashed across his face when he found the holster missing. He tried to scramble backward, away from her, but his injuries betrayed him. He collapsed back with a hiss of pain. "Easy," Ellie said, keeping her voice low and calm. She stood up slowly, showing him her empty hands. "You are safe. You are in my house." His eyes locked onto hers. They were dark, swimming with confusion and fear. "Where is my gun?" he rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. "It is on the table," Ellie said, nodding toward it. "You are safe here. I am Ellie Marsh. You collapsed at my door during the storm." He stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked around the kitchen, the stove, the clean floor, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. It seemed to take him a long time to understand what he was seeing. "Crowley's men," he muttered, the words slurred. "They were right behind me. The fence line. There is no one here but me and my boarders." Ellie said, "No one followed you. The storm covered your tracks." He blinked, fighting to stay conscious. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him gray and shaking. "Water," he whispered. Ellie poured a cup from the pitcher and brought it to him. She knelt, supporting his head so he could drink. He drank greedily, water running down his chin. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "Rest now," Ellie told him. "You need to sleep." He looked at her one last time, a look of profound, exhausted gratitude. Before his eyes closed and he sank back into the darkness, morning brought a silence that was almost deafening after the violence of the storm. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, innocent of the havoc it had wrought the night before. Ellie was up before dawn, checking on Jonah. He was still sleeping, his breathing deeper and more regular. She moved him to the small cot in the pantry off the kitchen so he would be out of the way of the boarders. But secrets in a town this size had a way of getting out before breakfast. When Ellie went outside to check the damage to the house, she saw it, Jonah's horse. It had been tied to the railing of her porch, huddling against the leeward side of the house during the storm. It was a sturdy bay gelding, saddle still on, shivering in the morning chill. Ellie cursed under her breath. She had forgotten the horse in the chaos. Mrs. Miller, her nearest neighbor, was already out shaking rugs. She stopped when she saw the horse. Her eyes narrowed, darting from the animal to Ellie, and then to the closed door of the boarding house. She did not say a word, but she turned and walked briskly toward the center of town. Ellie's stomach twisted. She led the horse to the barn quickly, unsaddled it, and gave it hay and water. But the damage was done. By 10 o'clock, the sheriff was at her door. Sheriff Brady was a thick-set man with a mustache that hid his mouth and eyes that gave nothing away. He was not a bad man, Ellie thought, but he was a man who knew where his bread was buttered, and the butter usually came from the nuanced influence of men like Silas Crowley. "Morning, Ellie," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sheriff," Ellie said, blocking the doorway with her body. "Can I help you? Heard you might have a guest," he said, his tone casual but his eyes trying to look past her into the hallway. "Folks say there is a strange horse in your barn. I have a new boarder." Ellie lied. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "He arrived late last night." "In the storm?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That is mighty determined travel. He was caught in it. I took him in. I run a boarding house. Sheriff, that is what I do." "Who is he?" "His name is Mr. Jones," Ellie said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "He is just passing through." The sheriff chewed on the inside of his cheek. "Well, you be careful. Ellie, there is talk of trouble out toward the Crowley Range. Some drifter caused a mess, hurt some cattle. Just keep your eyes open. I always do," Ellie said. He lingered for a moment longer, sensing her tension, before nodding and turning away. "I will be seeing you, Ellie." She closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. She had lied to the law. She had lied for a man she did not know, a man who muttered about violence in his sleep. She went back to the pantry. Jonah was still asleep, the quilt pulled up to his chin. Ellie stood in the doorway, watching him. She should be frightened. She was frightened, but beneath the fear, there was something else. She watched the way his eyelashes cast long shadows on his cheeks. She looked at the strong, square line of his jaw, softened now by sleep. She noticed how his hand, resting on the quilt, was curled into a loose fist, as if he were ready to fight even in his dreams. It was a feeling she had thought was dead and buried in the grave on the hill. It was a pull, a magnetic hum in the air between them. It was the sudden, overwhelming awareness of another human soul in her space. Not just a boarder, not just a paycheck, but a man. She stepped closer, her skirt brushing the doorframe. The floorboard creaked. Jonah shifted, turning his head toward the sound without waking. Ellie pressed her hand to her chest. This was dangerous. He was dangerous. The town would destroy her if they found out who he really was, and she was certain he was not just a drifter named Jones. But as she looked at him, she remembered the weight of his body when she dragged him in from the storm. She remembered the heat of his skin, and for the first time in years, the loneliness that ate at her belly felt a little less hungry. She backed out of the room quietly, closing the door on the sleeping cowboy. But she could not close the door on the feeling he had woken inside her. The fever broke on the third day, retreating like a tide that had scoured the shore clean, leaving behind wreckage that would take time to rebuild. Jonah Reyes sat on the edge of the cot in the narrow pantry, his head hanging between his shoulders. The room smelled of dried herbs and lye soap, a domestic scent that felt foreign to a man who had spent the last decade breathing dust and horse sweat. When he finally stood, the world tilted dangerously to the left. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white, waiting for the floor to solidify beneath his boots. He was thinner than he had been a week ago. His ribs, already bruised from the beating he had taken, now stood out in sharp relief against his skin, but the fire in his blood was gone. He found Ellie in the kitchen. She was kneading dough, her back to him, her shoulders moving with a rhythm that suggested she had done this 10,000 times. "Morning, ma'am," Jonah said. His voice was rough, like gravel crushed under a wagon wheel. Ellie spun around, her hands dusted with white flour. She looked at him, her eyes widening slightly, scanning him from head to toe. "You are up," she said. It was not a question. "I have been down long enough," Jonah replied. "I owe you for the care, and for the roof." "You owe me nothing," Ellie said, turning back to the dough, though her movements were stiffer now. "You were sick. I would have done the same for a dog caught in that storm." Jonah gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "I reckon a dog might have been better company." He moved to the table, his steps careful. He did not sit. A man like Jonah Reyes did not sit in a woman's kitchen unless he was invited, and perhaps not even then. He leaned his hip against the sturdy oak sideboard. "My name is Jonah Reyes," he said. "I figure I should tell you that properly, now that I am not out of my head." Ellie wiped her hands on her apron and faced him. "Eleanor Marsh. Most folks call me Ellie." Jonah nodded. "I am a hand. I have worked cattle from the brush country in Texas all the way up the trails to the railheads in Kansas. Spent the last 2 years pushing herds up into the Wyoming basin." He watched her face carefully. He saw the question in her eyes. The question about why a man with that much range under his belt was stumbling onto her porch, half dead with no horse and no kit. But she did not ask it. "And before that?" she asked instead. "Before that, I was where I was born. Down near the border." Jonah said, "My mother was Mexican. My father was a man who passed through. I learned early on that having a foot in 2 worlds usually means you do not have a place to stand in either of them." He saw the flicker of recognition in her expression. She knew what it was to be looked at sideways. "I am heading north," Jonah added, lying smoothly about his destination to cover the fact that he had nowhere to go. "I ran into some trouble with a fence line dispute a few days back, lost my gear." He did not mention Silas Crowley. The name sat in his throat like a stone, heavy and choking. To speak it was to summon a devil, and he was not strong enough to fight devils just yet. Ellie looked at his hands, then at the empty holster that hung by the door. "You are welcome to stay until your strength comes back fully, Mr. Reyes, but I cannot offer you free board forever. My pantry is not deep. I do not take charity, Mrs. Marsh," Jonah said, his tone hardening. "If I eat, I work. I saw your barn door is hanging off its top hinge, and that woodpile out back is looking low." Ellie hesitated. She was used to men who offered help with one hand and took something else with the other. But she looked at Jonah's face, at the dark, serious eyes that held no lechery, only a grim sort of pride. "The axe is in the shed," she said, "and the coffee is on the stove. Help yourself before you start." That was how the arrangement began. It was transactional, cold, and necessary. Over the next week, Jonah became a fixture in the yard. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, conserving his energy as his body knit itself back together. He took the rusted hinges off the barn door, heating them in the forge of the local smithy, where the blacksmith eyed him with open suspicion, and hammering them straight before rehanging the heavy oak planks. He took over the water hauling. Ellie watched from the kitchen window as he carried 2 full buckets from the well, his arms straining, the muscles cording beneath his shirt. He did not spill a drop. He split logs with a rhythmic, violent grace, the axe rising and falling, the sound of wood splintering echoing off the dry hills. Ellie found herself listening for that sound. It was a heartbeat of industry that had been missing from the boarding house since Frank died. At first, they ate separately. Jonah took his plate to the porch or the barn, leaving Ellie to the uncomfortable silence of the dining room with Mr. Abernathy and Mr. Lewis. But one morning, the wind was howling too fiercely to sit outside. Jonah stood awkwardly in the kitchen, plate in hand. "Sit," Ellie said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. "The stew will get cold." Jonah sat. He ate quickly, with the focus of a man who never knew when the next meal was coming. "This is good stew," he said. "It is mostly potatoes." Ellie replied. "It is hot," Jonah said. "That counts for a lot." Their routines began to braid together. In the mornings, Ellie would find the stove already stoked, the heavy lifting done before she had even tied her apron. In the evenings, Jonah would sit on the back steps, whittling a piece of cedar, while Ellie shelled peas or mended sheets nearby. They did not speak much, but the silence between them changed. It lost its sharp edges. It became a companionable thing, a shared space where neither of them had to pretend to be happy or whole. But the high plains did not tolerate comfort for long. The spring had been deceptive, offering a few weeks of mild sun that had coaxed Ellie's garden into life. She had planted rows of beans, squash, and tomatoes, counting on the produce to see her through the winter. Then, the killing frost came. It descended in the night, a silent, invisible assassin. When Ellie walked out the next morning, the world was white and brittle. The tomato plants were black skeletons, slumped against their stakes. The squash vines were turned to mush. Ellie stood at the edge of the garden, her hand over her mouth. The loss was not just emotional. It was financial ruin. That garden was her margin of error. Jonah came up beside her. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her it would be all right. He looked at the devastation and spat on the frozen ground. "We can salvage the root vegetables," he said. "The frost likely did not get deep enough to kill the potatoes or the carrots." "We?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Jonah looked at her. "I have got a spade. You have got a burlap sack. Let us get to work." They spent the morning digging in the hard, cold earth, rescuing what they could. By noon, Ellie's hands were numb, but the cellar had a modest pile of food. It was not enough, but it was not nothing. That night, the cold deepened, and the coyotes came down from the ridges. They were emboldened by the frost. Sensing the weakness in the land, Ellie heard them yipping and howling just beyond the fence line, their cries sounding like the laughter of madmen. She was in the kitchen, checking the lock on the back door, when Jonah walked in. He was carrying his rifle, the metal gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Those dogs are too close," Jonah said. "They smell the chickens. I'm going to sit up a while. Make sure they do not get any ideas." "You will freeze," Ellie said. "I have been colder," Jonah replied. He went out, wrapping his poncho around him. Ellie watched through the window. He stood like a statue near the coop, the rifle cradled in his arm, a dark sentinel against the starry sky. She went to bed, but she did not sleep for a long time, knowing he was out there, standing between her and the wild, made the knot of anxiety in her chest loosen just enough to breathe. But if the wilderness was dangerous, the town was cruel. Jonah could not stay hidden at the boarding house forever. He needed supplies for his work, nails and oil, and eventually, he had to ride into town. The reaction was immediate and venomous. It started at the general store. Jonah was buying a pouch of tobacco when the conversation at the Cracker Barrel died. Two men, ranch hands for one of the smaller outfits that Crowley was slowly squeezing out, stared at him. "That is him," one muttered. "The one staying at the Widow Marsh's place? Looks like a half-breed to me," the other said. Loud enough to be heard, Jonah did not turn. He paid for his tobacco, counting out the coins with steady hands. "Heard he is the one who did for Crowley's boy." The first man whispered, "A killer, hiding behind a woman's skirts." Jonah's shoulders tightened, the muscles in his neck corded, and for a second, the air in the store grew electric. He turned slowly, his eyes cold and flat, void of any human warmth. He looked at the men, holding their gaze until the first one looked away. Shuffling his feet, Jonah walked out without a word, but the poison spread. Ellie heard it when she went to church on Sunday. She saw the way Mrs. Miller pulled her skirts aside. She heard the snippets of conversation as the congregation filed out. "She collects trouble," a woman whispered. "First that husband of hers, and now this. Taking in a stray dog is one thing, but a man like that, it is indecent. He is working for his keep." Ellie wanted to scream. "He fixed my roof. He saved my potatoes." But she said nothing. She walked home with her head high, but the shame burned her. It was an old shame, a familiar coat she had worn since Frank died, but now it was heavier because it included Jonah. One evening, a few days later, the tension of the outside world seemed to breach the walls of the house. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the kitchen, blowing out the lantern on the table. The room plunged into darkness. Ellie gasped. Startled, "I will get it," she said, fumbling for the box of lucifers. "I have it." Jonah's voice came from the dark, closer than she expected. A match flared, a tiny burst of sulfur and light. Jonah was standing right beside her. He lowered the flame to the wick, and as the light bloomed, their hands brushed. It was a simple contact, skin against skin, but it sent a jolt through Ellie that made her breath hitch. Jonah froze. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. They were close, so close she could smell the tobacco and sage on his clothes, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched, heavy and sweet. Then Jonah cleared his throat and stepped back, retreating into the shadow near the stove. "The wind is kicking up again," he said. Ellie busied herself with the coffee pot, her hands shaking slightly. "Yes, it sounds like rain on the tin roof." I used to love that sound when I was a girl. My father had a barn with a tin roof. We would sit in the hayloft and listen to it drum. Jonah leaned against the counter. "I remember the sound of rain on canvas," he said softly. "In the army, or on the trail. It meant you were going to be wet and miserable, but it also meant the dust would settle. There is a smell to it. Sage and wet dirt. It is the best smell in the world. It smells like life," Ellie said. Jonah looked at her then, really looked at her, and Ellie felt a flush rise from her neck to her cheeks. It was a look of recognition, of two people who had been lonely for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to be seen. He looked away first, shifting his weight. "I best check the horses." He left, but the warmth of him stayed in the kitchen. That night, Ellie lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The wall between her room and the pantry was thin. She could hear Jonah shifting on the narrow cot. She could hear the slow, rhythmic sound of his breathing. It was a comfort, that sound. It was a tether to the world of the living, but it also brought a sharp, biting ache. She looked at the empty pillow beside her. Frank had been dead for 3 years. He had been a hard man, a cruel man often, but he had been her husband. Was it a betrayal to find comfort in the presence of a stranger? Was it a sin to want the warmth of a living body when the man she had promised herself to was rotting in the ground? She rolled over, pulling the quilt up to her ears, trying to shut out the sound of Jonah's breathing, but she strained to hear it all the same. The next day, Jonah was repairing a loose floorboard on the porch. He was on his knees, hammer in hand. Ellie came out with a broom, and the screen door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang. Jonah moved with the speed of a striking snake. In a blur, he had rolled to his feet, the hammer raised like a weapon, his body crouched and ready to kill. His eyes were wide, wild, seeing something that wasn't there. Ellie dropped the broom. "Jonah! It is just the door!" Jonah blinked, the wildness slowly draining from his face. He lowered the hammer, his chest heaving. He wiped a hand across his mouth, looking embarrassed and angry at himself. "Sorry," he muttered. "You're jumpy as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rockers," Ellie said, trying to make light of it, though her heart was pounding. Jonah sat back down on the porch rail. "I have not slept in the same place for more than 3 weeks in 5 years. Ellie, you get used to sleeping with one eye open. You get used to moving before you think. Why? Ellie asked. Why keep moving? Jonah looked out at the horizon. Because nothing sticks to a moving target. I do not believe in being wanted. Ellie, not by a town, not by a family, and certainly not by a woman. It is safer to be a ghost. You are not a ghost, Ellie said firmly. You are a man who eats too many biscuits and fixes my barn. Jonah smiled, a rare, fleeting thing that transformed his face. I do like your biscuits. The fragile peace they were building was shattered the following afternoon. Ellie was hanging laundry on the line when a rider appeared on the road. He did not pass by. He turned his horse, a sleek, well-fed black stallion, up her drive. It was Hank Dobbs. Ellie's blood ran cold. Hank was Silas Crowley's foreman. He was a man who smiled with his mouth while his eyes measured you for a coffin. He wore a fine coat and silver spurs, but everyone knew he did Crowley's dirty work. Jonah was chopping wood by the shed. He stopped mid-swing, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He did not run. He walked slowly toward the house, placing himself between Ellie and the rider. Hank pulled his horse up, tipping his hat with exaggerated politeness. Afternoon, Mrs. Marsh. Mr. Dobbs, Ellie said, gripping a wet sheet in her hands. To what do I owe the pleasure? Oh, just being neighborly, Hank said. His eyes slid to Jonah. And seeing as you have got company, I thought I would say hello. You must be the new help. Jonah stood with his feet apart, his hands hanging loose by his sides. I am working for my keep. Hank leaned forward on his saddle horn. Working hard. I see, mister. Crowley heard there was a stranger about. He likes to know who is crossing his land. I am not on his land, Jonah said. I am on Mrs. Marsh's land. For now, Hank said. The threat was subtle, wrapped in a casual tone, but boundaries can be tricky things. Mister, Crowley has a long memory. Friend. He wants a word with you. About old business. I have no business with him, Jonah said. Hank smiled. And it was a terrible thing to see. Everyone has business with Mr. Crowley eventually. You might want to ride over and pay your respects before the invitation gets insistent. He tipped his hat to Ellie again. Ma'am, you keep yourself safe. Now. These are dangerous times. He wheeled his horse around and galloped off, dusting, lifting in a cloud behind him. Ellie stood frozen. Jonah watched the rider until he disappeared over the ridge. He knows, Ellie whispered. He knows who you are. Jonah turned to her. His face was grim. I should go. I am putting a target on your back. Ellie. No, Ellie said, the word bursting out of her before she could think. If I stay, they will come back, Jonah said. Let them come, Ellie said, though her voice shook. I will not have you run off to be shot in the back on some empty road. You are safe here. Safe? Jonah laughed bitterly. No one is safe near Crowley. Ellie looked at him. She knew he was right. Keeping him was inviting disaster. It was risking her home, her livelihood, maybe her life. But the thought of the silence returning, of the empty chair at the table, of the nights with only the wind for company, it was unbearable. I am the owner of this boarding house, Ellie said, drawing herself up. And I say who stays and who goes. You have not finished the woodpile. Jonah Reyes. Jonah looked at her for a long moment, struggling with his own demons. Then he nodded once, short and sharp. I reckon I have not, but the fear lingered. It hung over the house like smoke. 2 nights later, the air was clear and biting cold. The stars were shards of ice in the black sky. Jonah came out the back door and found Ellie sitting on the bottom step, wrapped in her shawl, shivering. She was not crying, but she looked small, diminished by the vastness of the night. Ellie? Jonah asked softly. She looked up. Her eyes were wide and dark. I cannot sleep, she said. It is too quiet. I feel like the silence is going to swallow me whole. Jonah sat down beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a wall against the dark. It is a big country, he said. It makes you feel small. It is not the country, Ellie said. It is the waiting. Waiting for what? Ellie turned to him. The moonlight washed out the color in her face, making her look like a porcelain doll that had been broken and glued back together. "For it to be over," she whispered. "For the loneliness to stop eating at me. I wake up every morning and I am surprised I am still here. I have been waiting so long to feel anything but empty." The confession hung in the cold air. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to Jonah in years. He looked at her, at the trembling of her lips, at the grief etched into her brow. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm. Without thinking, he reached out. His hand, rough and scarred, cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped her eye. Ellie leaned into his touch. She let out a shuddering breath, her eyes fluttering closed. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the heat of his hand on her skin. The air was charged, thick with a desire that terrified them both. They breathed in sync, heavy and jagged. Jonah leaned in, drawn by a gravity he could not resist. Then, he stopped. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He stood up abruptly, putting distance between them. "Jonah?" Ellie whispered, her voice laced with confusion and hurt. "I cannot," Jonah said, his voice ragged. "I am a drifter. Ellie, I am a man with a price on his head and blood on his hands. You deserve a man who can give you a life, not a man who is just going to be one more mistake in your story." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Ellie alone on the steps, the cold rushing back in to fill the space where his warmth had been. But this time, the cold burned. The town of Oakhaven, pinned beneath the vast and indifferent sky of the high plains, began to shrink around Eleanor Marsh. It was not a physical shrinking, for the dusty streets remained as wide and empty as ever, but a closing of ranks. The invisible walls that separated the respectable from the unwanted were being built higher, stone by cold stone, and Silas Crowley was the mason. The pressure arrived not with a shout, but with the quiet scratching of pens on deeds. Crowley was moving on the smaller homesteads, offering prices that were insults to the men who had broken their backs on the hard soil. But with the drought lingering and the cattle markets shifting, desperation made men take what they could get, one by one. The neighbors to the north sold out and moved on, leaving their shacks to the wind and their land to Crowley's growing empire. The boarding house felt the tremor of this shift. Mr. Lewis, the bank clerk, was the first to leave. He came downstairs on a Tuesday morning, his carpetbag packed, his eyes refusing to meet Ellie's. "I have found a room closer to the bank. Mrs. Marsh," he mumbled, placing his key on the sideboard. "It is just convenient." Ellie knew it was a lie. Mr. Lewis was a timid man who valued his standing with the bank manager, and the bank manager dined with Silas Crowley every Sunday. Staying at the Marsh place was no longer a neutral act. It was a statement of defiance. And Mr. Lewis was not a defiant man. Mr. Abernathy followed 2 days later. He was less polite about it. "It is getting too hot here. Ellie," he said, coughing into his handkerchief. "And I do not mean the weather. That cowboy of yours brings a shadow with him. I am an old man. I cannot afford trouble." When the door closed behind him, Ellie sat at her kitchen table and counted the coins in the tin box she kept hidden in the flour jar. There were fewer than she needed. The flour sack was low, the coffee was nearly gone, and the wood pile, though neatly stacked by Jonah, would not pay for taxes or grain. Sheriff Brady stopped by that afternoon. He did not come inside. He sat on his horse by the gate, looking over the peeling paint of the fence. "Afternoon. Ellie," he called out. "Sheriff," Ellie replied, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped onto the porch. "Crowley bought out the Henderson place yesterday," the sheriff said, watching her closely. "That is the last parcel on the East Ridge. He is consolidating. Ellie, he likes things tidy. My deed is clear." "Sheriff," Ellie said, her voice steady, "and my land is not for sale." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, leather creaking. "A clear deed does not stop a fire, Ellie, or an accident. And harboring a man like that Reyes fellow, it makes folks nervous. You are a woman alone. You ought to think about your safety." "I am thinking about it." Ellie said. The sheriff tipped his hat, but there was no respect in the gesture. Just a warning, suit yourself. But when the hammer falls, do not say nobody told you to move. Ellie watched him ride away, the dust swirling in his wake. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but beneath it, a harder ridge of anger. They wanted to squeeze her out. They wanted to erase her, just as they had tried to erase her past. She turned back to the house, but stopped. Jonah was standing in the shadow of the barn doorway. He had heard. He said nothing, but his face was set in a grim, stony line. He looked at the retreating figure of the sheriff, then at Ellie, and turned back into the darkness of the barn. The next morning, the sun had not yet crested the horizon when Ellie woke to the sound of a horse stamping. It was a soft, muffled sound, but in the silence of the dawn, it was enough. She threw her wrapper over her nightgown and ran out the back door, her bare feet cold on the porch steps. Jonah was by the corral, tightening the cinch on his saddle. He was fully dressed, his bedroll tied behind the cantle, his rifle in the scabbard. He looked ready to ride 1,000 miles. "Jonah!" Ellie called out, her voice sharp with panic. He froze, his hand on the latigo. He did not turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was closed, a mask of indifference that she knew was a lie. "Go back inside. Ellie," he said, "it is cold." "You are leaving," she said, walking across the yard until she was standing right beside him. "You are going to leave without a word." "It is better this way," Jonah said, checking the stirrup leather. "Better for who?" "For you," he snapped, turning on her. "Look at this, Ellie. Your borders are gone. The law is circling like a buzzard. Crowley is buying up the world around you. As long as I am here, you are a target." "I was a target before you got here," Ellie cried. "Do you think they liked me before? Do you think they respected me? I was just the widow, Marsh, the woman who worked at the saloon, the woman whose husband died in a drunk brawl. You did not bring the hate. Jonah, you just gave them a new excuse to show it." Jonah shook his head. "This is different. Crowley thinks I killed his son. He will burn this house down to get to me. I can ride out, draw them off. I can lead them away from you." "And then what?" Ellie demanded. "You ride until they catch you, until they hang you from a cottonwood?" "If that is what it takes," Jonah said softly. "You deserve peace. Ellie, you deserve a life that is not poisoned by my trouble." "Peace?" Ellie let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You think I had peace? Let me tell you about the peace I had before you came. I had silence. I had a town that looked through me. I had a house full of ghosts." She stepped closer, her eyes blazing with tears she refused to shed. "You think you know about my past? You think you know about Frank?" Jonah looked at her, startled by the venom in her voice. "Folks say he was a hard man. He was a devil," Ellie whispered. "The town remembers him as a loud drunk, a man who liked to fight. They do not know what he was like when the door was closed. They do not know about the bruises I hid under high collars." She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "You see that grave on the hill? The one with no name?" Jonah nodded slowly. "That was not an accident of nature," Ellie said, her voice trembling. "I was 6 months along. Frank came home one night, mad about money, mad about the weather, mad that I existed. He shoved me. I fell down the cellar stairs." Jonah flinched as if she had struck him. "I lost the baby 2 days later," Ellie said, the tears finally spilling over. "And the town whispered that I must have done something to provoke him, or that I was too weak to carry a child. They blamed me. Jonah!" "They blamed me for bleeding." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing the tears. "And when Frank died, when his horse threw him in the canyon, I was the one who saddled that horse. I knew the cinch was worn. I saw the fray in the leather, and I let him ride out anyway." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. Ellie had never spoken those words aloud. She stood shivering, waiting for Jonah to look at her with disgust, to see her as the monster she sometimes feared she was. But Jonah did not pull away. He dropped the reins and stepped toward her, his eyes dark with pain. "It was a land dispute," he said, his voice low and rough. "That is what started it with Crowley. Ellie looked up, confused by the shift. Crowley's son, Jonah continued. He was a boy, barely 20, but mean as a rattlesnake. He wanted a piece of water that belonged to an old sheep herder. I was riding by. I saw the boy pistol whip the old man. I saw him raise the gun to finish it. Jonah looked down at his hands, the hands that had fixed Ellie's roof and carried her water. I did not shoot him. Ellie, I jumped him. I tried to wrestle the gun away. We fought in the dust. The gun went off. It was his hand on the trigger, but it was my weight on him. He looked at her, his gaze intense and pleading. I watched him die. I watched the light go out of his eyes, and I knew right then that the truth did not matter. Crowley would never believe his son was a killer. He needed a monster to blame, so he made one out of me. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm but not touching. We are both carrying ghosts. Ellie, we are both carrying shame for things we did not choose. I thought leaving would save you, but maybe I was just running because I was scared to look at you and see someone who understands. Ellie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the mirror of her own soul. He was not a drifter. He was a survivor. He was not a killer. He was a protector who had been punished for his courage. I am tired of being alone with my ghosts. Jonah, Ellie whispered. Please, do not leave me with them. Jonah stared at her for a long heartbeat. Then, slowly, he reached back and loosened the cinch he had just tightened. He pulled the saddle from the horse's back and set it on the rail. I am not going anywhere, he said. The day passed in a strange, suspended tension. They moved around each other carefully, the weight of their confessions filling the rooms like a heavy fog. They had stripped themselves bare, revealing the ugly, jagged parts of their histories, and the air vibrated with the shock of it. By evening, the sky turned a slate gray, heavy and oppressive. The wind died, replaced by a brooding stillness. Then, the heavens opened. It was not a gentle rain. It was a deluge, a cold, driving storm that lashed the high plains with fury. It turned the dust of the yard into sucking mud in minutes. The temperature plummeted, bringing the chill of the mountains down to the flatlands. Inside the boarding house, the noise was deafening. The rain hammered on the roof, sounding like 1,000 stones being thrown at once. Ellie was in the kitchen, trying to keep the stove hot against the encroaching damp. When she heard a crash from the pantry, she ran to the door. Jonah was standing in the middle of his small room, looking up. A stream of water was pouring through the ceiling, splashing directly onto his cot. The old shingles, dried and warped by the sun, had finally given way under the assault. The roof! Jonah shouted over the roar of the rain. It is giving way! We need buckets! Ellie yelled back. For the next hour, there was no time for awkwardness or ghosts. There was only the frantic, physical battle to save the house. They worked as a single unit, driven by necessity. Jonah dragged the soaked mattress into the kitchen. Ellie ran for pots, pans, and the large wash basin. The leak spread. Water began to drip in the hallway. Then near the chimney. Jonah grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the shed, rushing back inside, dripping wet, mud streaking his boots. "Help me get this up," he commanded, jumping onto a chair to nail the corner of the tarp to the rafters, trying to funnel the water into the basin. Ellie held the heavy canvas, her arms aching, water running down her elbows and soaking the front of her dress. Her hair came loose from its pins, plastering to her neck. "Hold it steady," Jonah grunted, hammering a nail with the heel of his boot because the hammer was out of reach. They slipped on the wet floor, collided, and steadied each other. Jonah's hands were on her waist to lift her onto a stool. Ellie's hands were on his shoulders to balance him. They were cold, wet, and exhausted, their breath coming in white puffs in the chilled air. Finally, the tarp held. The aggressive pouring slowed to a manageable trickle, directed safely into the wash basin. The immediate danger was past. They stood in the kitchen, the lamp casting a dim, golden light that reflected off the puddles on the floor. The only sound was the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water hitting metal and the roar of the storm outside. Ellie was shivering uncontrollably. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin. Her teeth chattered. "You are freezing," Jonah said. His voice was rough, breathless. He grabbed a towel from the rack near the stove, one of the few dry things left, and stepped toward her. "Here." He did not just hand it to her. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight. His hands lingered on the rough fabric, his knuckles brushing her neck. Ellie looked up at him. Jonah's shirt was plastered to his chest, translucent with water, showing the dark shadow of the scars beneath. Water dripped from the ends of his hair, running down the sharp line of his jaw. He looked wild and beautiful and terrified. "Let me help you," Ellie whispered. She reached out and took the other end of the towel, bringing it up to wipe the water from his face. She dried his forehead, his cheeks. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold. As she lowered the towel, her hand rested against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, hard, fast, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. The air in the kitchen changed. It became thick, heavy with unspoken things. The adrenaline of the crisis was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed nerve of desire. They were two broken people who had spent years convincing themselves they did not need to be touched. And now the lie was crumbling. Jonah went still. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then up into her eyes. His gaze was intense, searching for a sign to stop, a sign to run. "Ellie," he breathed. His voice was a warning. "I am tired." "Jonah," Ellie said, her voice trembling but clear. "I am tired of the cold. I am tired of pretending that I do not feel this." She took a step closer, closing the inch of space between them. "I do not want to be alone tonight." Jonah let out a ragged sound, half groan, half sigh. The restraint he had worn like armor shattered. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "There is no going back from this." "I do not want to go back," Ellie answered. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of two starving souls finally finding sustenance. Jonah's mouth was hot and urgent, tasting of rain and salt. Ellie's hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to her. Years of loneliness, of grief, of fear, poured into that moment. It was a reclaiming of life in the face of death and ruin. The storm raged outside, trying to tear the world apart, but in the circle of their arms, they were building something new. Jonah lifted her effortlessly, and Ellie wrapped her legs around him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. He carried her not to the pantry, but to the stairs, toward the room she had slept in alone for 3 years. The darkness of the bedroom swallowed them, but it was not the cold darkness of the grave. It was a warm, breathing dark, filled with whispered names and the sound of skin against skin. The morning sun was a traitor. It shone bright and harsh through the window, exposing everything. Ellie woke with a start, her heart hammering. For a second, she was disoriented. Then the weight of the night crashed down on her. The empty side of the bed was cold, but the sheets were rumpled. Panic surged in her chest. Had he left? Had the daylight brought regret? She scrambled out of bed, pulling her wrapper tight, feeling the ache in her muscles and the flush on her skin. She hurried down the stairs, her mind racing. He is gone. He realized he made a mistake. He realized I am damaged goods. She burst into the kitchen and stopped. Jonah was there. He was standing by the stove, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He was dressed in dry clothes, his spare shirt and trousers, and his hair was damp from washing. He turned when he heard her enter. He looked unsure, almost shy. The hard, guarded mask was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made him look younger. "Morning," he said. His voice was quiet. "Morning," Ellie replied, clutching the lapels of her wrapper. Jonah held out a mug. "I made coffee. It is strong." Ellie took it. Her fingers brushed his, and the memory of the night flashed between them. Heat, whispers, the feeling of being held. Both of them looked down at the mugs, unsettled. "Did I?" Jonah started, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "I did not want to wake you. You were sleeping deep. I thought you might have left," Ellie admitted, her voice small. Jonah looked at her, his eyes steady. "I told you yesterday, Ellie!" "I am not going anywhere, unless you want me to." Ellie took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and hot, grounding her. "No, I do not want you to go." They stood there in the kitchen, the silence awkward but not unkind. They were charting new territory, walking on ice that was thin and beautiful. They did not know what to call this thing between them yet, but neither of them was willing to let it go. But the town had eyes, and the town had tongues. Later that morning, Ellie went to the porch to sweep away the mud from the storm. As she worked, she saw Mrs. Miller and Mrs. Henderson walking down the road. They were not passing by. They were coming to the gate. Ellie leaned on her broom, bracing herself. "Good morning, Eleanor," Mrs. Miller said. She did not smile. Her face was pinched, like she had smelled something sour. "Mrs. Miller," Ellie said. "We heard things," Mrs. Henderson said, looking past Ellie toward the house. "Mr. Smith, the delivery man? He was passing by at first light. He said he saw that man, that drifter, coming out of your room." Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. The window, the curtains had been open. "We just wanted to pray for you." "Eleanor," Mrs. Miller said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It is hard for a woman alone. Satan finds cracks in the foundation. But to fall into immorality with a man of his kind?" Ellie gripped the broom handle until her knuckles turned white. "It is none of your business." "Oh, but it is the town's business," Mrs. Miller said, stepping closer. "Decency is everyone's business. If you are running a house of ill repute, the sheriff will have to know." "Get off my property," Ellie said, her voice shaking with rage. Just then, the screen door creaked open. Jonah stepped out. He was not wearing his gun belt, but he looked dangerous all the same. He stood beside Ellie, his shoulder brushing hers. He looked at the women with a calm, cold detachment. "Mrs. Marsh asked you to leave." Jonah said, "Mrs. Miller gasped, clutching her shawl. You see, Eleanor? He is bold as brass. Shameful." Jonah did not raise his voice. "There is no shame in this house. Ma'am, the only shame is standing at the gate, judging folks you do not know." Sheriff Brady rode up at that moment, as if summoned by the scent of trouble. He slowed his horse, looking from the women to Ellie and Jonah. "Problems, ladies?" he asked. "Sheriff, Mrs. Miller cried. "We were just counseling Eleanor on her situation. It seems the rumors were true." The sheriff looked at Ellie, his eyes hard. "Loose morals bring loose trouble. Ellie, sinners fall first when times get hard. I told you to be careful. Now folks are talking." Ellie felt the old wound tearing open, the years of being the outcast, the years of biting her tongue. She looked at the sheriff, then at the women. She saw the disgust in their eyes. Then she felt Jonah's hand. He reached out and took hers, weaving his fingers through hers in plain sight of God and the sheriff. His grip was warm and solid. "He is not a boarder," Ellie said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "He is with me. And if that is a sin in your eyes, then you can take your prayers elsewhere." The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The sheriff stared at their joined hands, his expression darkening. "You are making a mistake, Ellie," the sheriff said softly. "A big one, maybe," Ellie said, lifting her chin. "But it is my mistake to make." She turned to Jonah. "Come inside. Jonah, the coffee is getting cold." Jonah squeezed her hand. A silent promise. He did not look back at the town as he followed her through the door. Inside, Ellie leaned against the closed door, her legs trembling. She had done it. She had claimed him. She had burned the bridge to the town's good graces, assuming she had ever really been on it. Jonah stood before her. He looked at her with a fierce, quiet pride. "You did not have to do that," he said. "Yes, Ellie said, looking up at him. I did. I am done hiding. Jonah stepped closer, resting his forehead against hers. Then let them talk. Let them come. We will be ready. But even as he said it, they both knew the truth. The town was not just talking anymore. The lines were drawn. And out on the range, Silas Crowley was surely hearing the news. And he would not be coming with prayers. He would be coming with fire. The heat that settled over the high plains that summer was not merely a condition of the weather. It was a weapon. The sun rose each morning like a hammered copper disc, searing the moisture from the earth until the ground cracked open in jagged fissures that looked like thirsty mouths. The wind, which had once been a nuisance, turned into a scourge. It carried the topsoil away in suffocating clouds, burying fence lines and turning the sky a perpetual, bruised purple. Silas Crowley used the drought the way a carpenter used a chisel, chipping away at the resolve of everyone who stood in his path. And no one stood more starkly in his path than Eleanor Marsh and Jonah Reyes. The siege on the boarding house began with silence. The supply wagon that usually brought flour, coffee, and kerosene from the railhead simply stopped stopping. When Ellie walked into town to inquire, Mr. Higgins at the Mercantile would not meet her eyes. I cannot spare the inventory. Mrs. Marsh, he said, wiping a counter that was already clean. The freight lines are running slow. Ellie looked at the shelves behind him, stocked with sacks of grain and tins of peaches. I see the inventory right there. Mr. Higgins, I have money. Mr. Higgins sighed, leaning in close so the other customers, who had all suddenly become very interested in the floor, would not hear. It is not about the money, Ellie. Hank Dobbs paid me a visit. Said the road to your place is unlucky. Said wagons tend to lose a wheel if they head that way. I cannot afford to lose a wheel. Ellie. Ellie walked out with an empty basket, her spine stiff, but her stomach churned with fear. Then came the intimidation. The few remaining boarders, 2 railroad surveyors who had stayed despite the gossip because Ellie's stew was cheap and her linens clean, were intercepted on their way back from the site. Ellie never learned exactly what was said to them, but they packed their bags that same evening, leaving a week's rent on the table and apologizing in hushed tones. You are safer elsewhere, one of them muttered as he tipped his hat. That is what the foreman said. Safer elsewhere. With the boarders gone, the income that kept the house breathing vanished. The tin box in the flour jar was hollow. Ellie stopped drinking coffee so Jonah could have it before he went to work. She patched her dresses until they were more thread than fabric. The sheriff added the weight of the law to Crowley's pressure. He rode out on a Tuesday, sweating through his shirt, his face flushed with the heat and his own discomfort. I am checking licenses. Ellie, he said, not bothering to dismount. My license is valid until the new year. Ellie said, standing on the porch. You signed it yourself. Sheriff, things change, the sheriff said, squinting at the horizon. There is a clause about maintaining a disorderly house, harboring fugitives. If you keep harboring trouble, Mrs. Marsh, I might have to revoke your right to operate. It is for the public good. Jonah was in the barn, sharpening an axe. The sound of the stone against metal was a rhythmic rasp that cut through the conversation. The sheriff looked toward the barn, his jaw tightening, before turning his horse back toward town. Desperation drove Jonah to take risks that made Ellie's blood run cold. With no money coming in, he sought work wherever he could find it, usually the jobs that other men were too smart or too frightened to take. He spent 3 days breaking wild mustangs for a livery stable 20 miles south. He came home bruised, his shoulder wrenched. Limping from a kick that had narrowly missed his knee, he brought home $4. He took a job guarding a shipment of gold dust for a small mining outfit, riding shotgun through the canyonlands where bandits watched from the rim rock. He came home dusty and hollow-eyed, his hand cramping from gripping his rifle for 12 hours straight. He brought home $6. Each time he saddled his horse in the gray light of dawn. Ellie stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him ride away until he was nothing but a speck against the vast indifference of the plain. Do not go. She wanted to beg him, But she knew they needed the money to buy flour at inflated prices from a trader 3 towns over. She knew they needed cartridges for the Winchester, so she kissed him goodbye, a fierce, terrified pressing of lips, and spent the day imagining him lying dead on a lonely road, shot by a bandit or one of Crowley's hired guns. The town's prejudice, fed by Crowley's influence, curdled into something darker as the heat wore on. The drought was killing cattle. Carcasses bloated in the sun. Black with flies, the creeks turned to mud, then to dust. Crowley spun a story that spread through the saloons and the church pews alike. He claimed that the bad luck had started when the half-breed arrived. He claimed that Jonah carried a curse, a darkness from his past that was poisoning the land. It was a ridiculous, medieval lie, but thirsty. Frightened men looked for someone to blame, and Jonah was the perfect vessel for their anger. Ellie heard it in the whispers at the well. She saw it in the way men spat when Jonah rode past. "He is bad blood," she heard a rancher say outside the blacksmith shop, mixing with a white woman. "It is against nature. No wonder the rain stopped." One evening, Jonah came home early, his face dark. He had been let go from a fencing job after only half a day. "They said I was spooking the cattle," he told Ellie as he washed up at the basin. "They said the cows would not eat when I was near." He looked at her, water dripping from his chin, his eyes full of a quiet, burning fury. "It is not the cows. Ellie, it is the men. They are talking about driving me out. For everyone's good. Let them try," Ellie said, slamming a pot onto the stove. "They might do more than try," Jonah said softly. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, on a night when the moon was hidden behind a thick veil of dust. Jonah had taken a day job moving a small herd for a stubborn old rancher who refused to sell to Crowley. It was hard work in the heat, pushing thirsty animals through the scrub. He was riding back long after sunset, his body aching, his mind drifting to the thought of Ellie waiting in the kitchen with a lamp burning. He was crossing the dry creek bed at the bottom of the wash, a place where the cottonwood trees grew thick and gnarled, their roots exposed like skeletal fingers. The shadows were deep here. The attack did not come with a warning. There was no challenge, no shout. A rope hissed through the air. Jonah tried to duck, but the loop settled over his shoulders and yanked tight, pinning his arms to his sides. He was jerked backward out of the saddle, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the wind out of him. Before he could draw a breath, boots were on him. 3 men, maybe 4. They wore flour sacks over their heads with holes cut for eyes. They kicked him with brutal efficiency. In the ribs, the kidneys, the head. "Get him up," a voice growled. It was a voice Jonah did not recognize, muffled by the cloth. Rough hands hauled him to his feet. His head swam. Blood ran into his left eye. He struggled, landing a boot on someone's shin, hearing a satisfying crunch, but a rifle butt slammed into his stomach, doubling him over. "Cattle thief," the voice hissed. "We found the strays in your tracks, boy." It was a lie. There were no strays, but facts did not matter in the dark. Another rope was thrown over the thick branch of a cottonwood. The noose was slipped over his head, the coarse hemp biting into the tender skin of his neck. "This is what happens to curses," another man whispered. They began to pull. Jonah felt his feet leave the ground. The rope tightened, cutting off his air, crushing his windpipe. Panic, primal and white-hot, exploded in his brain. The world began to go gray. He kicked wildly, his boots seeking purchase on the air. He saw Ellie's face in the darkness behind his eyes. "No." The word was a silent scream in his mind. "No." His right hand was pinned, but his left hand, slippery with sweat and blood, managed to snake down to his boot top. He had a knife there, a small skinning blade he kept for work. The men were laughing now, struggling with his weight. Jonah's fingers found the handle, with the last reserve of oxygen burning in his blood. He slashed upward blindly. The blade caught the taut rope above his head. It was a desperate, 1 in a million stroke. The hemp, strained to its limit, snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. Jonah dropped. He hit the creek bed hard, rolling instantly. He gasped, the air rushing into his crushed throat like fire. The men shouted in confusion. Jonah did not wait. He slashed out again, catching a man in the leg. The man screamed. Jonah scrambled into the brush, moving on hands and knees, deeper into the tangled roots where horses could not follow. "Get him!" someone yelled. But Jonah was gone, swallowed by the shadows he knew better than they did. He ran until his lungs burned, until the taste of copper filled his mouth, until he collapsed in the tall grass a mile away, listening to the hoofbeats of his attackers fading into the night. Ellie had been pacing the porch for 2 hours. The stew had boiled down to a thick paste. The lamp was burning low. When she heard the footsteps, stumbling and uneven, coming up the drive, she grabbed the shotgun she had started keeping by the door. "Who is there?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Ellie." It was a croak, a broken sound. She dropped the gun and ran into the dark. Jonah was 20 yards from the house, swaying like a drunkard. When she reached him, he collapsed into her arms, his weight nearly dragging them both to the ground. "Jonah!" she screamed. She smelled the blood before she saw it. He was caked in dirt. His shirt was torn to ribbons. "Get me inside," he rasped. "Before I fall." She half carried, half dragged him into the kitchen. She kicked the door shut and bolted it. When she turned him toward the light, a cry of horror escaped her throat. His face was a mask of bruises, one eye swollen shut. His lip was split, but it was his neck that stopped her heart. A raw, red ring encircled his throat, the burn of a rope. "They tried to hang you," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Jonah slumped into a chair, his head hanging back. His chest heaved as he fought for air through his bruised windpipe. "They called it justice, cattle theft." Ellie's shock shattered into a rage so pure it nearly blinded her. It was the rage of a woman who had lost everything and refused to lose one thing more. She flew to the stove, grabbing the kettle, the basin, the clean rags. Her hands shook, but her movements were precise. She knelt between his legs, unbuttoning what was left of his shirt. "Look at me," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Look at me." "Jonah!" He opened his good eye. It was glazed with pain and shock. "You are alive," she said, dipping the rag into the warm water. "Do you hear me? You are alive." She began to wash him. She cleaned the grit from the rope burn, her touch feather-light, though every flinch he gave tore at her heart. She washed the blood from his ribs, revealing purple blooms of bruising that wrapped around his torso. "They are cowards," she hissed, the tears finally spilling over, hot and angry, filthy, spineless cowards. Jonah watched her. He watched the way her tears dripped into the basin, turning the water pink. He reached out, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and gripped her wrist. "Ellie," he whispered. She stopped, looking up at him. When the rope pulled tight, Jonah's voice broke. He swallowed hard, wincing. When the rope pulled tight, I did not fear hell. I did not fear dying. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, ignoring the pain it caused him. I was terrified that I would never see your face again. That was the only thing. Ellie let out a sob. She dropped the rag and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck, careful of the wounds, but needing to feel the solid reality of him. "I have you," she wept. "I have you." They stayed like that for a long time, huddled in the kitchen while the dry wind howled outside. Two survivors clinging to each other on a life raft in a sea of hate. It was not a night for passion. It was a night for the desperate, clawing need to confirm that the other heart was still beating. By morning, the fear had crystallized into something colder and harder. Jonah could barely speak. His throat was swollen, his voice a ragged whisper. But he was moving. He was packing his saddlebags. Ellie stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching him. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I have to draw them off," Jonah rasped. "If I stay, they will burn the house next time. I will ride west, make a trail. They will follow." "No," Ellie said. Jonah paused. "Ellie." "No!" Ellie crossed the room and grabbed the saddlebags, yanking them from his hands. "I am not doing this again. Jonah, I am not watching you ride out to die for me. I will not be abandoned again. Do not you dare try to be a martyr." Jonah looked at her helplessly. "Then what do? We cannot fight a whole town. We cannot fight Crowley's money." "We do not fight his money," Ellie said, her eyes narrowing. "We fight his lies." She paced the room, her mind working furiously. "Last night, you said they accused you of cattle theft. Why? To give them a reason." Jonah said, "To make it look legal." "Exactly. Crowley needs the law. He hides behind it. He uses the sheriff. He uses forged deeds." Ellie stopped. "Wait, the deeds? What about them?" "When Mr. Lewis stayed here, the bank clerk, he drank too much one night. He talked. He complained about the extra work. He said Crowley was making him backdate signatures. He said he was filing claims on land that belonged to dead men who had no kin." Jonah straightened up, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "Backdating signatures? That is fraud." "And Mr. Henderson," Ellie continued, "the pieces falling into place. The old rancher who lost his land last month? He told me Crowley produced a bill of sale from 10 years ago, but Henderson swore he never signed it. He said he would testify if he thought it would do any good." She looked at Jonah. "You are not the only victim. Jonah, Crowley has stepped on half this county. He thinks everyone is too scared to talk. And they are," Jonah said. "But what if they weren't?" Ellie asked. "What if someone gathered the proof? What if someone put it all together?" "I know a deputy," Jonah said slowly. "Young kid named Miller. Not related to the hateful Mrs. Miller. He gave me water when I was in the cell that time the sheriff hauled me in for questioning. He hates Crowley. He thinks the sheriff is bought and paid for." "And the lawyer," Ellie said. "Mr. Abernathy mentioned a lawyer who passed through last spring. A federal man, looking into land grants. He left a card. I think I still have it in the desk." Jonah looked at Ellie. The despair that had clouded his eyes was clearing, replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. "We would need hard proof. Papers, witnesses. Then we get them," Ellie said. "We stop running. We stop hiding. We fight him." The partnership that formed in the days that followed was quiet, precise, and deadly serious. They were no longer just lovers. They were conspirators. They established a routine. Jonah did not ride out for work anymore. He stayed close to the house, ostensibly recovering, but in reality, he was turning the boarding house into a fortress. He cleaned the Winchester rifle and the shotgun. He taught Ellie how to load fast, how to shoot without flinching. They developed signals. If Ellie placed the oil lamp in the left window of the parlor, it meant the sheriff was around. If she hung a red cloth on the line, it meant Crowley's men were watching. Jonah began to make night visits. He rode out not to work, but to talk. He met Deputy Miller behind the livery stable in the dead of night. The young man was shaking, terrified of losing his job, but his conscience was heavier than his fear. He whispered names. He confirmed that the sheriff was burying complaints filed against Crowley. Ellie rode to the Henderson shack. The old man was bitter and broken, living in a lean-to, but when Ellie asked him if he would stand up in court, he spat on the ground and said, "I've got nothing left to lose. Mrs. Marsh, I will tell the devil himself what he stole from me." Ellie found the lawyer's card. She wrote a letter, careful and detailed, outlining the fraud, the intimidation, and the attempted lynching. She paid a boy $3, the last of her savings, to ride 2 towns over and mail it, so the postmaster in Oak Haven would not intercept it. The danger grew with every secret meeting. Crowley's men were circling closer. They rode by the house daily now, rifles across their saddles, staring at the windows. But inside the house, something beautiful was growing amidst the fear. They stole moments of tenderness like thieves stealing diamonds. In the kitchen, while planning their next move, Jonah would pause and press a kiss to the pulse point of Ellie's wrist. In the barn, while checking the horses, Ellie would rest her head against his back, listening to his breathing, drawing strength from his solidity. One evening, after a tense day where Hank Dobbs had sat on his horse at the gate for an hour just watching them, they sat at the kitchen table. The letter was sent. The allies were whispered to. The trap was set, but they did not know if it would snap on Crowley or on them. Ellie reached across the table and took Jonah's hand. His knuckles were still scabbing over from the fight in the creek bed. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. Jonah turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. "Yes, me too," Ellie said. Jonah looked at her. His eyes were dark and bottomless. "But I am not running. Ellie, I am done running. Whatever happens, we face it standing up, and together," Ellie added. "Together," Jonah repeated. The wind howled outside, throwing dust against the siding, scratching at the glass. But inside, the air was still. The hesitation was gone. They were two people standing on the edge of a cliff, holding hands, ready to jump or to fly. The uncertainty of the future was vast, but the certainty of their hearts was absolute. The paper was nailed to the front door of the boarding house with a violence that shook the frame. Sheriff Brady wielded the hammer, his face slick with sweat and a shame he refused to acknowledge. The sound of metal striking wood, thud, 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 echoed across the dry yard like gunshots. Ellie stood on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, her fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeves. She watched the sheriff step back, admiring his handiwork. The notice was stark white against the weathered gray wood, a beacon of official ruin. Notice of seizure. It was a legal fiction, a lie dressed up in the finery of the court. The document claimed that a survey from 1852 had been overlooked, and that the land upon which Eleanor Marsh's home stood was, and always had been, the property of the Crowley Cattle Company. "You have 3 days to vacate, Mrs. Marsh," the sheriff said. He did not look at her. He looked at the nail he had just driven. "This is a lie," Ellie said. Her voice was low, trembling not with fear, but with a cold, vibrating rage. "My deed is recorded in the county ledger. My husband bought this land fair and square 20 years ago." "Records get lost," the sheriff said, finally turning his eyes to her. They were hard, flat eyes. "Mistakes get made. Mr. Crowley has the original grant. The judge signed the order this morning because Mr. Crowley bought the judge his breakfast." Jonah's voice cut through the hot air. He stepped out from the shadowy interior of the hallway. He moved differently now. The limp from the beating was nearly gone, replaced by a coiled tension. His hand rested near his hip. Not on a gun, for he was not wearing one in the presence of the law, but the threat was there in his stance. "Be careful, boy," the sheriff warned, his hand drifting to his own holster. "You are walking a thin line. I'm standing on a porch," Jonah said. "Until 3 days are up. This is still Mrs. Marsh's house, and you are trespassing." The sheriff glared, his jaw working. Then he spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust at the bottom of the steps. 3 days, Ellie. Then the deputies come to clear the premises. If you are smart, you will be gone before then." He walked to his horse and mounted up. As he rode away, 3 other riders appeared on the rise of the road. They were Crowley's men, Hank Dobbs among them. They did not approach. They simply rode slowly back and forth along the fence line, rifles resting conspicuously across their saddles. They were sharks circling a raft, waiting for the wood to splinter. The community of Oak Haven watched the slow strangulation of the boarding house with a mixture of relief and guilt. It was easier to look away than to speak up. When Ellie walked into town that afternoon to plead her case to the town council, doors closed before she could reach them. She saw Mr. Higgins turn the sign in the mercantile window to closed as she approached. She saw the blacksmith suddenly become very interested in a horseshoe, turning his back to the street. Near the church, a group of women were arranging flowers for the Sunday service. They saw Ellie coming, her dress dusty, her face pale with strain. They did not invite her in. "Mrs. Miller stepped forward, her hands clasped piously in front of her. "Eleanor," she said, her voice pitched high enough for the street to hear. "We are praying for you." Ellie stopped. "Praying for what?" "Mrs. Miller. For justice? Or for me to disappear so you do not have to look at what you are allowing to happen?" "We are praying you find peace," Mrs. Miller said, sniffing. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Perhaps this is his way of telling you that you have strayed. A woman alone, taking in a man of that sort. It invites darkness. You should let the Lord handle it and move on. There is work in the city for women in your position." Ellie looked at them. These women she had known for years. Women whose children she had watched grow, whose husbands she had fed. She saw the fear behind their self-righteousness. They were terrified that if they showed her kindness, Crowley's gaze would turn on them next. "My position?" Ellie asked quietly. "My position is standing on my own 2 feet, and if the Lord is handling this, he is using a very crooked pen." She turned and walked away, leaving them murmuring in her wake. But the bravado crumbled the moment she crossed her own threshold. That night was the longest of her life. The heat did not break with the setting sun. The house trapped the day's warmth, turning the rooms into ovens. Ellie sat on the floor of her kitchen, the heart of the home she was about to lose. A single kerosene lamp burned low on the table, casting long, wavering shadows. Around her, she had gathered the few things that truly mattered. A tin box of letters from her mother, the deed to the house, now apparently worthless, and the small, carved wooden horse from the drawer. She held the toy in her hand, running her thumb over the smooth wood. It had been meant for the baby she never held. The baby lost to a fall down the cellar stairs, a fall caused by a shove from a husband the town now remembered as a saint. The ghosts swirled around her in the stifling air. She heard Frank's voice, slurred with whiskey, telling her she was worthless. She heard the whispers of the town, the poor Ellie and the loose woman. If she left, if she packed her bags and rode out in 3 days, she would be proving them right. She would be the victim they always said she was. She would be admitting that her life here, her struggle, her survival, meant nothing against the whim of a rich man. She squeezed the wooden horse until it bit into her palm. Giving up the house meant giving up herself. It meant letting her entire life be defined by other people's cruelty. A shadow fell across the floor. Jonah stood in the doorway. He had been on watch in the barn, but he had seen the light still burning. "Ellie," he said softly. She did not look up. "They are going to take it. Jonah, they are going to take it all." Jonah stepped into the room and sat on the floor opposite her. He did not try to offer false hope. He simply sat, his long legs stretched out, his back against the cupboards. "I have been thinking," he said. His voice was reflective, lacking its usual guarded edge. "About what? About running?" he said. Ellie flinched, but he went on. "I have always run. Ellie, when the army got too hard, I left. When the ranch bosses looked at me sideways, I moved on. When that boy died and Crowley pointed his finger, I ran. I told myself it was survival. I told myself I was a tumbleweed, meant to roll." He looked at his hands, scarred and brown, but that is a lie. I was not rolling. I was fleeing. I believed them. Ellie, I believed I was the curse. I believed I did not deserve to be rooted anywhere. He looked up at her, and his eyes were fierce in the dim light. But these last few months, fixing this roof, digging those potatoes, waking up knowing there was coffee on the stove and a woman who looked at me like I was a man. Not a mistake. He reached across the space between them and took the hand that held the wooden horse. "If I leave now," Jonah said, his voice thickening with emotion, "then Crowley wins. Not just the land. He wins the story. He gets to write the end, and the end is that Jonah Reyes is a killer and a drifter who ruins everything he touches." He squeezed her hand. "I do not want that ending. Ellie, I want to stay. Not just for me, but for us." Ellie looked at him, tears swimming in her eyes. "But how? The law is with him. The guns are with him. Then we make the law look him in the eye," Jonah said. "We do not wait for the deputies to come here. We go to them. We take this fight to the center of town, in broad daylight, where they cannot hide in the dark." "It is suicide," Ellie whispered. "Maybe," Jonah said, "but it is better than disappearing." Ellie looked down at the deed on the floor, the paper that represented her sweat and blood. Then she looked at Jonah, the man who had ridden through a storm to die at her door and lived to save her from the silence. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She wiped her eyes. She placed the wooden horse gently in her pocket. "Tomorrow at noon," she said. "We go to town." The morning sun rose white and hot, bleaching the color from the world. At 11 o'clock, a strange procession left the boarding house. Ellie rode her mare, wearing her best dress, a dark blue calico that she had mended with painstaking care. Her head was high, her face set in a mask of grim determination. Jonah rode beside her on his bay gelding. He had cleaned his gun. The coat on his hip gleamed. He wore his best shirt, the one Ellie had washed and ironed. They did not ride alone. At the crossroads, they were joined by Jeremiah Henderson. The old rancher sat on a mule, clutching a sheaf of papers in his arthritic hands. He looked terrified, but when he saw Ellie, he nodded. Behind the livery stable, Deputy Miller was waiting. He was pale, sweating profusely, looking like he might vomit, but he mounted up when Jonah signaled, "I hope you are right about this." "Reyes," the deputy muttered. "I am right," Jonah said. "Just tell the truth. That is all you have to do." They rode down the main street of Oakhaven. The town went silent. People stopped on the boardwalks. Faces appeared in windows. It was a funeral march that felt like an invasion. They stopped in front of the land office, which was also the base of operations for the Crowley Cattle Company. Silas Crowley's carriage was parked out front. Ellie dismounted. Jonah was beside her instantly, his body a shield between her and the building. Henderson and Miller followed. They walked through the double doors. The office was cool, smelling of expensive cigar smoke and oiled leather. Silas Crowley sat behind a massive oak desk, studying a map. Sheriff Brady stood by the window. Hank Dobbs was leaning against the wall, whittling a stick with a long, curved knife. Crowley looked up. He was a man of 60, with silver hair and a face that had once been handsome before greed had sharpened all the angles. "Well," he said, leaning back, "Mrs. Marsh, you are early. The eviction is not until Friday. I am not here to vacate." "Mr. Crowley," Ellie said. Her voice was steady, projecting to the open door where townsfolk were beginning to gather. "I am here to dispute your claim." Crowley laughed. It was a dry, scratching sound. "Dispute? With what? Sentimental tears? The law is clear. The law is a liar," Ellie said. She stepped forward and slammed a stack of papers onto his desk. Crowley did not flinch. "And what is this?" "Affidavits," Ellie said. "From the county clerk in the next district. Proof that the survey you filed was signed by a surveyor who died 3 years before the date on the document." The room went very quiet. The sheriff shifted his weight. "And this," Ellie said, slapping down another paper. "A statement from Mr. Henderson, swearing that the bill of sale you hold for his land bears a signature that is not his." Crowley's eyes narrowed. He picked up the papers with 2 fingers, as if they were soiled, and dropped them into the wastebasket. Forgeries. Desperate scratches from a desperate woman. And him? Crowley pointed a finger at Jonah. "You bring this mongrel into my office? A killer? A man who murdered my boy in cold blood?" "I did not kill your son," Jonah said. His voice was low, vibrating with a dangerous calm. "He killed himself with his own hate, and you know it." Crowley stood up. His face turned a mottled red. "You half-breed trash. You stain the air you breathe. You think anyone in this town believes you over me? I built this town. I own this town. Not all of it," a voice said from the back. Deputy Miller stepped forward. He was trembling, his hands shaking so hard his gun belt rattled, but he spoke. "Deputy," the sheriff barked. "What are you doing?" "I am doing my job." "Sheriff," Miller said, his voice cracking, "I cannot do it anymore. I cannot hide the files." Miller looked at Crowley. "I heard you, Mr. Crowley. I was in the back room when you told Hank Dobbs to take care of the Reyes problem. I heard you tell him to use the rope. You ordered a lynching." A gasp went through the crowd that had gathered outside the door. "You little rat," Hank Dobbs snarled, straightening up from the wall. He dropped the stick and the knife. His hand hovered over his gun. Crowley looked at the faces outside, the shopkeepers, the farmers. He saw the doubt. He saw the fear turning into realization. The facade of the benevolent patriarch was cracking, revealing the tyrant beneath. "Clear the room," Crowley ordered. "Sheriff, arrest these people." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at Miller. He looked at the crowd. He did not move. "I said clear the room," Crowley shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. Hank Dobbs did not wait for the sheriff. He saw his master losing control, and he reacted the only way he knew how. He went for his gun. Jonah was faster. He had been waiting for this. He did not draw his weapon to kill. He moved to protect. "Down!" Jonah roared. He shoved Ellie hard, sending her stumbling behind the heavy oak desk. Hank's gun cleared leather. Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet shattered the glass of the front window, showering the onlookers with shards. Screams erupted from the street. Jonah drew and fired in one fluid motion. His bullet took Hank Dobbs in the shoulder, spinning him around. Hank's gun clattered to the floor, but Crowley had pulled a Derringer from his vest pocket. It was a small, cowardly gun, but deadly at close range. He fired wildly at Jonah. Jonah jerked as the bullet grazed his side, tearing through his shirt and cutting a furrow along his ribs. The impact staggered him. "Jonah!" Ellie screamed from the floor. Crowley cocked the hammer for a second shot, aiming at Jonah's chest. Jonah gritted his teeth against the burning pain. He steadied his aim. He fired. The bullet struck Crowley's hand, destroying the Derringer and sending it flying. Crowley shrieked, clutching his mangled hand to his chest, collapsing back into his chair. Silence slammed back into the room. It was heavy, ringing with the echo of the shots and the smell of sulfur. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the broken window. Hank Dobbs groaned on the floor, clutching his shoulder. Crowley whimpered, blood dripping onto the fraudulent deeds on his desk. Jonah stood in the center of the room, his gun still raised, smoke drifting from the barrel. His side was wet with blood, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. Outside, the townspeople stared. They looked through the shattered window. They saw the truth. They saw Silas Crowley, the man who claimed to be their protector, willing to kill a woman and a witness to keep his power. They saw the sheriff standing impotent and complicit. And they saw the drifter, the curse, standing tall, bleeding, having thrown himself in front of the bullet meant for Ellie. "That is enough." "Silas," the sheriff said quietly. He walked over to Crowley. He took the handcuffs from his belt. He did not look at Crowley. He looked at the floor. "You are under arrest," the sheriff said. "For fraud and attempted murder." Crowley stared at him, shock overriding the pain. "You work for me." "Not anymore," the sheriff said. Deputy Miller moved to secure Hank Dobbs. The tension in the room broke. Jonah holstered his gun. He turned toward the desk. "Ellie?" he asked. Ellie scrambled up. "I am here. I am unhurt." She saw the blood on his side. "Jonah." Jonah smiled weakly. "It is just a scratch." Then his eyes rolled back, and his knees buckled. He collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. "Jonah!" Ellie dropped to her knees beside him. She pressed her hands against the wound in his side, the warm blood oozing between her fingers. "Someone get a doctor!" she screamed at the crowd. She leaned over him, her tears falling onto his dusty face. "Jonah, stay with me. Do not you dare leave me now. We won. Do you hear me? We won." Jonah blinked, fighting the darkness that swarmed the edges of his vision. He looked up at her. Her face was framed by the light from the broken window. She looked fierce and terrified and beautiful. "Ellie," he whispered. "I am here." She sobbed. "I am right here. I have been waiting for you. Jonah, I have been waiting my whole life for you. Please." She did not care who heard. She did not care about the town, or the judgment, or the shame. She poured her heart out on the floor of the land office. Jonah's hand moved weakly, covering hers where she pressed against his wound. He took a shallow breath. "You are the first place," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "The first place that ever felt like home." Ellie bent down and kissed his forehead, rocking him slightly. The townspeople watched in silence. The men took off their hats. The women, even Mrs. Miller, lowered their eyes. They saw the blood on the floor. They saw the clasped hands. And for the first time, the prejudice that had blinded them cracked and fell away. They did not see a widow and a half-breed drifter. They saw a man and a woman who had walked through fire for each other. And in the silence of the aftermath, the shame shifted. It no longer belonged to Ellie Marsh. It belonged to Oak Haven, the town that had nearly killed the only two honest people left in it. The weeks that followed the shootout at the land office moved with the slow, thick pace of molasses in winter. The adrenaline that had sustained Ellie and Jonah through the siege evaporated, leaving behind the dull ache of recovery and the quiet, persistent work of healing. Jonah spent the first 10 days confined to the narrow bed in the spare room, the one with the window that looked out toward the endless, rolling plains. The bullet from Crowley's Derringer had dug a deep furrow along his ribs, cracking bone and tearing muscle. It was not a killing wound, but it was a cruel one, prone to infection and demanding stillness from a man who had never known how to be still. Ellie became his world. She moved through the room with the soft rustle of skirts and the scent of lavender soap. She changed his bandages twice a day, her hands steady even when the sight of the angry, red flesh made her stomach turn. She boiled willow bark for the pain and spooned broth into him when his fever spiked in the evenings. For the first time in her life, Ellie was not serving a boarder or obeying a husband. She was tending to a part of herself. One afternoon, the light in the room was golden and heavy with dust motes. Jonah was propped up against the pillows, his face pale, but the shadows under his eyes receding. "You have a light touch." "Ellie," he said, watching her rewrap the linen around his torso. "My mother had hands like that. She could pull a cactus thorn so fast you never felt it leaving." Ellie pinned the bandage, her fingers lingering against his warm skin. "You never talk about her. Your mother—" Jonah looked out the window. "There is not much to tell. She was a good woman who fell in love with a man who could not stay. She raised me to be polite, to work hard, and to never expect the world to be fair. She died when I was 12. Smallpox. I am sorry," Ellie said softly. "It was a long time ago," Jonah said, "but sometimes when the fever takes me, I can smell the sage she used to burn. It smells like safety." Ellie sat on the edge of the bed. "I know that feeling. My father, he was a harsh man, but he carved wood. In the evenings, the house would smell of cedar shavings. That smell makes me feel 6 years old again. It makes me feel like nothing bad has happened yet." They sat in silence, sharing the ghosts of the people who had made them. It was a new kind of intimacy, deeper than the desperate passion of the storm. It was the intimacy of two people slowly unspooling the tight knots of their pasts, trusting the other not to pull too hard. Outside the walls of the boarding house, the town of Oak Haven was undergoing a painful molting. The arrival of the federal marshal had been a spectacle. He was a tall man with a voice like a church bell, and he did not care about local politics. Silas Crowley was brought out of the jail in irons, his hand bandaged, his face gray and ruinous. He was loaded into a fortified wagon, destined for a federal court in Denver to answer for fraud, land theft, and attempted murder. The town watched him go in silence. There were no cheers, only the heavy, uncomfortable realization that they had let a monster rule them because it was easier than fighting him. Sheriff Brady did not wait to be arrested. He resigned the morning after the shootout, leaving his badge on the desk. By noon, he was gone, riding south toward the border, a man whose authority had evaporated the moment the truth shattered the glass of the land office window. The power structure that had suffocated Ellie for years was gone, leaving a vacuum, and in that empty space, new green shoots began to grow. It started with Deputy Miller. He was now acting Sheriff Miller, a title that seemed too big for his narrow shoulders, but he wore it with a nervous pride. He came to the boarding house 3 times a week. At first, he stood on the porch, hat in hand, sheepishly offering a sack of coffee or a fresh loaf of bread from the bakery. "Just wanted to check in," Miller would stammer. See how Mr. Reyes is healing. He is mending, Ellie would say, taking the offering. Thank you. Miller, eventually. The coffee turned into conversations. Miller would sit in the kitchen while Jonah sat in the rocker by the stove, asking Jonah for advice on handling drunk drovers or settling disputes without drawing a gun. Then came the others. The 2 railroad surveyors who had fled returned. They stood on the porch, their boots shuffling in the dust, looking everywhere but at Ellie's eyes. We heard the trouble is past Mrs. Marsh. One of them said, the camp food is terrible. We were wondering if our rooms were still open. Ellie hesitated. Her instinct was to slam the door. Where were you? She wanted to scream. Where were you when the wolves were at the gate? But she felt Jonah's eyes on her back. He was sitting at the table, whittling a piece of pine. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The rooms are open, Ellie said, her voice cool. But the rate has gone up, $2 a week, and payment in advance. The men paid without a murmur. The most surprising visitor came on a Sunday, Mrs. Gable, an older woman who had sat in the second pew of the church for 30 years. A woman who had once crossed the street to avoid Ellie, knocked on the door. Ellie opened it, bracing herself for judgment. Mrs. Gable looked at her shoes, then at Ellie. Eleanor, I have a growing backlog of mending. My eyes are not what they used to be. I recall you have a fine hand with a needle. I was wondering if I could hire you to help with the altar cloths. Ellie stared at her. The request was trivial, but the meaning was monumental. To touch the altar cloths was to be accepted into the heart of the sanctuary. It was an olive branch wrapped in linen. I do not know, Ellie stammered. I have my hands full here. Please, Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was thin, wavering. We were wrong. Eleanor, about many things. Let us start with the sewing. Ellie closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She walked into the kitchen where Jonah was testing his strength by lifting the heavy cast-iron skillet. They want me to sew for the church, she said. The same people who called me a fallen woman a month ago. Jonah set the skillet down. It is heavy, isn't it? What? The grudge, Jonah said. It is heavier than that iron pan, and it burns you just as bad if you hold it too long. I have a right to be angry, Ellie said, her eyes flashing. You do, Jonah agreed. You have a right to hate them forever. But if you shut them out, Ellie, you are still in the cage they built for you. You are just locking it from the inside now. Ellie looked at him. He was right. He was infuriatingly right. She took the job, and when she walked into the church parlor the next Tuesday, heads turned and silence fell. But Ellie sat down, threaded her needle, and began to stitch. And slowly, the conversation resumed, including her in the small, mundane rhythms of the town. As the weeks turned into months, the seasons shifted. The brutal heat of summer broke, giving way to a crisp, golden autumn. The drought eased with a series of gentle rains that turned the brown plains to a dusty green. Jonah's strength returned, though he moved with a new caution, favoring his left side. He and Ellie settled into a life that was quiet, domestic, and vibrantly alive. They shared the chores. They stood side by side at the wash basin, their elbows bumping, passing wet plates to be dried. They sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. The passion between them was not a constant storm. It was a deep, underground river. It was there in the way Jonah would pause while chopping wood to watch Ellie hang laundry, his eyes dark and hungry. It was there in the way Ellie would rest her hand on the back of his neck as she passed his chair, her fingers trailing over his skin. But the trauma of the past did not vanish overnight. There were restless nights. Ellie would wake up gasping, the memory of the cellar stairs or the sound of breaking glass shattering her sleep. Jonah would jerk awake at the sound of a coyote howling, his hand instinctively reaching for a knife, his breath coming in shallow rasps as he relived the feeling of the rope tightening around his throat. In those moments, they did not need words. Jonah would pull Ellie against his chest, his arms forming a solid wall between her and the dark. You are here, He would whisper into her hair, "You are safe. The cellar is gone." And when Jonah woke sweating and trembling, Ellie would smooth the hair back from his forehead, pressing her cool palms to his cheeks. "I have you," she would murmur. "The rope is cut. You are home." Their physical closeness became the antidote to the poison of their memories. To be held without demand, to be touched with tenderness rather than violence. It was a healing balm that soaked into their bones. One afternoon in late October, a new storm rolled in. It was not a dust storm, but a blustery autumn gale that rattled the eaves. The roof over the pantry, which they had patched with canvas during the siege, began to leak again. Jonah grabbed the ladder. "I am going up," he announced. "Not with that rib. You are not," Ellie said, grabbing a hammer. "We go up together." They climbed onto the sloped roof, the wind whipping Ellie's skirts and tearing Jonah's hat from his head. They wrestled with the new shingles, their mouths full of nails, shouting instructions over the wind. "Hold the end down," Jonah yelled, laughing as a gust tried to turn the tar paper into a kite. "I am trying," Ellie shouted back, her hair flying across her face. They slipped. They slid. And at one point, Ellie sat down hard on the pitch, sliding 3 feet before Jonah caught her boot. They froze, looking at each other, hearts pounding. Then they burst into laughter. It was a free, wild sound that carried over the rooftops of Oakhaven. They laughed until their sides ached, laughing at the wind, at the leak, at the absurdity of being alive and together on a roof in the middle of nowhere. "We should plant a garden," Ellie said later, as they sat on the ridge of the roof, looking out over the town, a real one. "Not just potatoes for survival." Jonah looked at the yard below. "The soil is hard. We can soften it," Ellie said. "I want flowers. Hollyhocks against the fence, sunflowers by the barn. I want color. Jonah, I am tired of everything being brown and gray." Jonah nodded, picturing it. "Sunflowers," he said. "Tall ones. They follow the sun. I like that." A few days later, Ellie woke with a specific need. It was a heaviness in her chest that she recognized. But for the first time, it did not feel like a burden she had to carry alone. "I need to go to the hill," she told Jonah over breakfast. He did not ask why. He simply stood up and reached for his hat. "I will saddle the horses." They rode out to the cemetery on the rise. The wind was biting, carrying the scent of frost. Ellie led the way to the back fence, to the small, unmarked cross that stood lonely against the sky. She dismounted and walked to the grave. The grass had grown over the mound, softening the raw earth. Jonah stood a few paces back, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He gave her space, but his presence was a warm weight at her back. Ellie knelt. She touched the weathered wood of the cross. "I am sorry I have not been here in a while," she whispered. The wind whistled through the fence slats. "It has been hard," she continued, speaking to the tiny life that had flickered out before it could begin. "But it is better now. I wanted you to know that I am not alone anymore." She looked back at Jonah. He met her gaze, his expression solemn and full of a quiet, steady love. "I found someone," Ellie said to the grave. "I found someone who stays. He would have liked you. He would have taught you how to listen to the rain." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. She felt a lightness in her chest, as if a stone she had been carrying for years had finally been set down. She was not leaving her grief behind, but she was no longer drowning in it. She walked back to Jonah. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," Ellie said. "Let us go home." That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with a piece of butcher paper spread out between them. The lamp cast a warm glow on Jonah's face as he pushed a charcoal pencil across the paper. "If we buy the Henderson lot," he said, drawing a square next to the existing property line, "we can extend the grazing land. We can run a small herd, not big enough to attract the cattle barons, but enough to sell beef to the railroad." "And the boarding house?" Ellie asked, tracing the line of the house. "We expand it," Jonah said. "Add a wing on the south side, real rooms, Ellie. Not just partition spaces, a place for travelers who want a clean bed and a hot meal." Ellie looked at the sketch. It was ambitious. It was a dream that required money they did not yet have, and years of work. It frightened her. This idea of building something permanent in a land that destroyed things so easily. It is a risk, she said. Living is a risk, Jonah replied. He covered her hand with his. But look. He wrote 2 words at the bottom of the paper. Reyes Marsh, we do it together. He said, my back and your brains, my gun and your grit. Ellie looked at the names side by side. It looked like a promise. It looked like a future. Okay, she whispered. We do it. The social prejudice of the town did not vanish entirely. Prejudice was a weed with deep roots. You could cut the top off, but the bitterness remained in the soil. There were still men who would not drink with Jonah. There were still women who crossed the street to avoid Ellie. One afternoon, outside the blacksmith's, a new hand who had drifted in from Texas spat as Jonah walked by. Watch yourself. Mongrel, the man muttered. Jonah stopped. He turned slowly, his face calm. But before he could speak, Ellie stepped off the boardwalk. She moved smoothly, placing herself beside Jonah, her arm slipping through his. She looked the man in the eye. Her gaze was cool and level. Is there a problem? She asked. The man blinked, surprised by her boldness. He looked from Jonah's scar to Ellie's determined face. He saw a unity that unnerved him. No, ma'am, he muttered, tipping his hat and backing away. No problem. They watched him go. You did not have to do that, Jonah said, though a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I can handle a loudmouth. I know, Ellie said, squeezing his arm. But you do not have to, not alone. Their refusal to hide, their insistence on walking arm in arm down the center of the street, became a quiet act of rebellion. They were a living testament to the fact that love could survive in the cracks of a hard world. The final scene of their story, or at least this chapter of it, took place on the porch where it had all begun. It was a cold evening in late November. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in bruised purples and deep indigos. The wind blew across the plains, carrying the smell of distant rain and the faint, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels fading down the road. Ellie stood at the railing, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. She was looking out at the darkness, listening to the wind howl. For a moment, the old feeling tried to creep back in, the ghost of loneliness. The memory of the nights when the silence was a physical weight, brushed against her skin. It whispered that all of this was fragile, that the winter would be hard, that loss was always waiting in the wings. But before the cold could settle in her bones, she felt warmth. Jonah stepped up behind her. He did not speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head. His body was solid. His heat seeped into her back, chasing away the phantom chill. Ellie closed her eyes, leaning into him. She felt the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder. I used to hate this wind, she said softly. It sounded like it was trying to tear the house down. And now? Jonah asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. Now it just sounds like the world turning, she said. She turned in his arms so she could look at him. The fading light cast shadows across his face, highlighting the scar on his brow and the lines around his eyes. He looked older than his years, worn by the miles he had traveled, but his eyes were clear and full of peace. Jonah, Ellie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Yeah, I was waiting for you, she confessed. Even before the storm, even before I knew your name, I was waiting for someone who saw me. Not the rumors, not the mistakes, just me. Jonah looked at her, and the vulnerability in his face broke her heart in the best way. I was drifting. Ellie, he said, I was just moving from one horizon to the next, thinking if I kept moving, the past couldn't catch me. I did not know what I was searching for. Not until I saw the light in your window that night. He brought his hand up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. You saved me. Ellie, you pulled me out of the storm. We saved each other, she said. She rose on her tiptoes, and he bowed his head. Their foreheads touched, a point of connection that felt more grounding than the earth beneath their feet. Then they kissed. It was a slow, lingering kiss, devoid of the frantic desperation of their first night. It was a kiss of gratitude. It was a kiss of belonging. It tasted of the cold air and the warm promise of tomorrow. When they broke apart, the night had fully descended. The wind still howled around the corners of the house. The land out there was still rough, filled with coyotes and drought and men with hard hearts. The future was unwritten and uncertain. But as Ellie and Jonah stood together on the worn wooden porch, the light from the kitchen spilling out to pool around their feet, the loneliness was gone. It had starved to death, leaving no room for anything but the fierce, enduring love that held them fast. They turned and walked back inside, closing the door against the wind, ready to face whatever the western horizon held. Together. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Ellie and Jonah resonated with you. If you enjoyed this tale of resilience and love on the high plains, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below letting me know where you are listening from and sharing your thoughts on the story in English. Your support keeps these legends alive. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.